Hi guys, welcome to another week of Exploration Saturdays. And today we have the program, The Core of Aches and Pains. And we're going to talk a little bit about the medicine and injuries that Lewis and Clark had on the trail. Now I wanted to start off by saying that the medicine they had 200 years ago in the early 1800s is not the medicine we use today. So a lot of these home remedies I'll talk about today that Lewis and Clark used, you should not try at home. Doctors today know a lot more about what causes illnesses, how to treat an illness, how to treat an injury. Today they know a lot more, but back then they didn't, and so a lot of these are actually today considered poison. For example, if you were living out on the frontier 200 years ago and you had a toothache, a common home remedy would to be using bat droppings to make a little ointment out of the bat droppings and to put it on your bad tooth. Now today we know this is a very bad idea. You should not try that, and it's very dangerous to do this. But 200 years ago, they really didn't know much about what would cause an illness, what would cause a fever, how to treat it. Back then, it was a lot on theories and not really on hands-on practice. For example, I have a little picture here. I'm going to call him Bob. Doctors, a lot of doctors 200 years ago thought a person was sick because there was an imbalance in their body. Maybe they had too much bad blood. Maybe they had too much excitement. Maybe they had too many nerves. So they thought there was an imbalance in your body and that your body had these 4 humors. Now today this really doesn't make sense because we know a lot more, but 200 years ago this made sense to the doctors that people had 4 humors and there was different levels in your body, and these 4 humors were blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Now, if we were to try to identify these humors today, we really couldn't because we know a lot more. But they thought if you were sick, it's because there was one of these imbalances, and the best way to fix you was either to purge you, and that would maybe make you vomit, or maybe you would go to the bathroom. They'll give you laxatives, so you go to the bathroom for number 2. Maybe they would make you sweat. They would give you something that would make you sweat a whole bunch. And sometimes, this was very common then, they would bleed you to rebalance your body. Now today, we know the body doesn't have these 4 humors. We know you should never, give anybody a purgative or a laxative or bleed somebody. That's something we don't do anymore. But back then, this was their best knowledge of the body, and this is what they knew how to do. But luckily, of course, we know a lot more today. So I just wanted to give you kind of idea of the medical knowledge at the time. They were getting better, but they still weren't really that great at all. So when Captain Lewis was planning for his expedition, he did work with a doctor, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who had some good ideas about keeping clean and hydrating. But he has some not so great ideas. Dr. Rush did like the idea of bleeding, that if you weren't feeling well, you just needed a good bleed. And basically what that meant was making a small cut on your arm. They would have a bleeding bowl, so a little bowl that they would hold up, and they would make a small cut and they would just bleed you. And at that time, they didn't know how much blood was in your body, so sometimes they would overbleed you, and this was very dangerous because if you lost too much blood, you could actually collapse, you could faint, and you could die. So it was a very dangerous time back then, I want to say. So Captain Lewis, he studied with Dr. Rush, and he bought some medicine, and we know from the journals and letters he wrote, he spent about $90 on all his medicine, his powders, his tools. And today, roughly, that's about $2,000 on medicine. So that's not actually a lot of money to spend on an expedition for all your soldiers. You're responsible for about 40 men, so it's really not that much money. But luckily, Captain Lewis, his mom, was an herbalist. And that is someone who uses plants to treat illnesses and sicknesses. So he was able to take that knowledge and use the plants he found in the Louisiana territory to treat some of his men. And we'll cover some of those plants in just a little bit. So Captain Lewis, he was purchasing supplies. Some of the things he bought, number 1, my favorite, are thunderclapper pills. And these were pills made by Dr. Rush. And these thunderclappers had mercury, which is a very dangerous poison today. So one, it already has poison in it. It had mercury and laxatives. And today laxatives aren't so bad. They actually help you, maybe, best way I can put it is they help you go number 2 in the bathroom. But back then they were taking too much of it. So they were really dehydrating themselves. So thunderclapper pills, not a good idea today. Back then, very common, very popular. So he had thunderclapper pills. He also had these Gulliver's salts, which were another laxatives. So they help you go to the bathroom. He also had this Peruvian bark, and that was for kind of reducing fevers. Now, Peruvian bark really actually was a pretty good idea. They were on the right track. I have a picture of it. They would eventually find out about, I think 60 years later, that Peruvian bark, it contains quinine, and quinine could actually treat malaria. But at the time, they actually weren't using enough of it to actually treat malaria. You need a lot of quinine, but they were on the right track with this one at least. And also some of the tools he would use to help him treat his men was a mortar and pestle. So it's like a little bowl that you would crush your medicine in. Maybe you're crushing some flowers, some leaves, some different seeds in there. He also has some dental tools, because you never know when you might need to be a dentist on the expedition. Not very great. The little dental tooth key was a long T-shaped tool that they would basically rip out your bad tooth. Not very fun. And of course a few other things like surgical saws, some linen or cotton for bandages. They had some soap. Here I got a soap bar right here. So there was some good and some bad medicine and tools. So Captain Lewis and Clark were as prepared as they could. They didn't have a doctor with them, so they would have to be the doctors to their men. Now I have some very fun goodies around me. So let's say you are on the trail with the captains, and for example, you are Sergeant Pryor, and you have a flu, you have a cold, you're snuffly, you have a headache, you're tired. Captain Lewis decided Sergeant Pryor would need some squirrel soup. So there's one treatment for you. If you ever have a cold, you could try some squirrel soup. Don't try it at home, actually. Another example of an injury on a trail that they had was a snake bite. On the 4th of July, the soldier named, let me check here, Fields, he got bitten by a snake. And so what they decided to use was that Peruvian bark, and they made a poultice. And a poultice is kind of like an ointment. It's kind of, they would have taken maybe some of the Peruvian bark, and they made like an ointment, like a mushy ointment to put on his snake bite. Probably didn't harm him, probably didn't do any good. And then let's say another example, an injury on the trail. You are Wiser, Soldier Wiser, and you are very, very bad. You feel very, very bad in your stomach. You have a horrible stomach ache. Captain Lewis decides to treat you with peppermint, maybe some peppermint tea. That's not so bad. But then he also gave the Soldier Wiser some laudanum. Laudanum has opium in it. And opium, it can be used to relieve pain, but it can also be very addicting. So today we don't use this in our common household medicine because it can be very addicting and it's not good to take too much of it. But back then, very common to use. And one more injury we'll look at will be the soldier Fraser. Fraser was working in the sun all day, and so he got a little sunstroke. He was a little overheated. And so Captain Lewis decided the cure for this would be bleeding. Remember we talked about bleeding earlier. And he gave him a dose of salts, which were laxatives. So he bled him, he gave him salts. This is not how you cure someone who's had a little too much time in the sun. But remember, they were working with the best knowledge they had. So of course, if you were on the expedition, you would be getting injuries. There were snake bites, wolf bites, colds, flus, stomach aches, exhaustion, sore eyes, sunstroke. One of the most interesting injuries on the trail was to Captain Lewis himself. Captain Lewis actually got shot in the bottom on accident. He was hunting with another soldier, and the soldier thought he was a deer and accidentally shot him. Luckily for Captain Lewis, He was able to recover. He actually made another poultice, kind of like that ointment, with Peruvian bark, and he actually made it out okay. Though I'm sure he was sore for a few weeks too. Now I collected some creative treatments that you can taste and try at home. But remember guys, you should never use these for an actual injury or illness. If you feel sick or you're injured, go to your parents, go to your family doctor, and they will use modern medicine to make you feel better. These are just for fun. These are gonna go in your explorer's kits if you are feeling adventurous, and if you wanted to, you could taste and feel and smell some of the ingredients they had in their explorer's kit. And some of these were what Lewis bought, and some of these are what he found on the trail. So let's start. When you grab your explorer's kit, the first thing you need in it is soap. And this is a good idea they had back then. They would use soap to clean the wounds. Today we have antibacterial ointment that's really great to use on injuries like cuts. But back then they stuck with soap, which was a pretty good start. So you can grab some soap. That would wash up your injury pretty well. Next thing, let's go back to our poultice. You have a swollen leg. So one of the things Captain Lewis tried was he found some wild ginger on the trail. He probably made this mush out of that ginger. He probably either applied it right to the swollen leg, or maybe he wrapped it in one of his linen bandages and would have stuck that on the swollen leg. So I have some ginger right here. You can find this at your grocery store, maybe your local farmer's market. I just bought this already purchased, or I purchased it already in a powder form, and it actually smells kind of good. It's really spicy. So if you wanted to, you can, kind of give it a little dab. You can lick it. It's not going to taste very good, but it is good if you're baking gingerbread cookies. So have you ever had gingerbread cookies? That's what ginger tastes like. So, swollen leg, he made a little ginger ointment for him. Next thing, let's go to if you want to repel some mosquitoes. You don't like those mosquitoes bites. What Captain Lewis and the men did, they had some bear grease. Unfortunately, I couldn't get my hands on any bear grease, but I have some lard, which would be the similar texture to bear's grease after it's solidified. So if you really want to kind of try what bear grease feels like, don't eat it. You can get some lard or some other fats, and it's just kind of slimy. But they actually would rub that in their skin to repel the mosquitoes. Another thing we can use was if you had a toothache, they would use cloves. And cloves kind of look like a popcorn seed. And the ones I got was already powdered up. But they would actually chew on those cloves, those little cloves that look like a seed, and they would chew on it. And cloves is very strong, so I'm not quite sure how they stomach it, but that's what they would use for a toothache. They would chew on that. So you can get some of this. You can buy them in their seed forms. You can buy it in their powder form. Smells really good. We use it for cooking and baking nowadays. So you can try smelling that, or you can try a little bit if you want to taste some of it. Another thing you need for your explorer's medicine kit is cinnamon. So if you like cinnamon toast, you'll definitely like cinnamon. And so this also smells really good. Kind of smells like Christmas to me. And this is something they would add to another medicine that might have tasted really bad. They would add cinnamon to make the bad tasting medicine taste good. So that wasn't too bad. Didn't harm anybody. And then another thing you could use was peppermint for a stomach ache. So I actually have some peppermint leaves right here that you can maybe nowadays, or this time of year is a little bit harder to find, but you can still find them in the grocery store. Our peppermint leaves, you see a lot of these maybe around Christmas time when everything's being seasoned with peppermint. But the little leaves here, they would throw in some hot water to make a tea. And I actually been soaking some peppermint leaves in my hot water already. And this actually probably did not do any harm to the men to just drink some peppermint tea for, an upset stomach. So I've had hot water, I've had some tea leaves in here. And it kind of just tastes like leaves, so not the worst thing. A little peppermint flavor right there. So if you wanted to try some peppermint tea for a stomach ache, you can buy some peppermint leaves at the store, soak it in hot water, and give it a go. But remember, make sure you don't drink your tea when it's too hot. You don't want to burn yourself. Another tea they made was from sage. And sage you can also find at your local grocery store or farmer's market, or these really long, thin leaves. And to me, they kind of look like lizard skin. So they're really cool to kind of feel. You can smell it. It has a really nice earthy smell to it. So that's another tea you could make. This one Captain Lewis used for a cold. If you had the sniffles, he would have some sage tea. And then my favorite treatment, if you weren't feeling very well, was chocolate. And so chocolate back then was actually very expensive. Anything made with sugar was expensive because it cost a lot of money to get sugar shipped to the United States. So if you were lucky enough to have chocolate, if you were feeling unwell, that would definitely perk you up because that was a very special treat back then. Now the last one I wanted to save because it's kind of fun. It probably didn't help, but it was very fun. When one of their soldiers had, let me see here, he had a swollen throat. What they decided to use was to make a poultice out of onions. So Captain Lewis actually found some onions growing on the trail and he made a poultice with it. So I have some little onions right here and we're gonna crush them up with our mortar and pestle, and then we're gonna kind of wrap it in one of our linen bandages, and then you could apply that to your swollen throat. Now, did this actually cure the swollen throat? Probably not, but it sounds like fun, so we're gonna give it a go. So I'm gonna take an onion, I'm gonna take off some of that skin right there. There we go. So a lot of these natural remedies that Captain Lewis found on the trail or things that he just saw growing along. And so he probably took an onion that he found growing on the trail. He probably chopped it up. He threw it in his mortar and pestle. This is not fun smelling onions. And then the really great thing is about the mortar and pestle is because it's very tough, and so it could crush things really nice and make it really smooth. So we're gonna crush our onion in there. And you probably did a few onions. There we go. And then you probably grabbed a little linen bandage to wrap up that onion. I'm just gonna use my hand here to kind of get it out of the mortar here. Now I'm just gonna chop up one onion because it's kind of smelly. But I'm gonna throw it there in my bandage. Sometimes, you know, this could be cold, this could be warmed up, and then they would apply it to your injury. I'm not gonna do that today because it kind of smells, and it's really not gonna make an injury feel any better. But if you wanna try, go ahead. This isn't gonna hurt you, but it's gonna be very smelly. So, and that was how they made a poultice. They would crush up whatever ingredient they're gonna throw in there, you know, like onions. He also made one with some ginger, so maybe you wanna throw some ginger in there. And they would just apply it to that injury, that bruise, and really probably didn't do any harm, but it was probably pretty fun to try. So guys, these are just a few examples of what they did on the trail. Feel free to do a little shopping to have the chance to smell and feel and taste some of the medicines they used on the trail. But just remember, these aren't to be used for actual injuries or illnesses, okay? Go to your parents and go to your doctor and they will help you. But I will add the worksheets up on our Facebook page underneath this video so you can download those and you get that medical list for your Explorers kit, and you can learn a little bit more about their injuries, their medicine, and I do have a little bit on that worksheet about Sergeant Floyd. He's probably one of the most famous illnesses on the expedition. And so you can find out how they treated Sergeant Floyd for his illness, for what they called bilious colic. So thanks for tuning in, guys, and we will see you next time.